The Chicago Bears are working through their long list of head coach interviews. But if some of these coaches keep winning in the playoffs, it could be a while before the Bears finally land their guy to lead the franchise.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok for now, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On the show today, I want to check in on the Bears head coaching search timeline. It's obvious that they have more candidates to interview than any other team, and that they've really cast a wider net than any other team. And so more work means more time. So are they at risk of this taking too long? Or if they're waiting for a coach like Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn with the Lions, and if that team goes to, say, the Super Bowl, then you're waiting until after the Super Bowl to be able to hire that coach. I mean, the Bears risking missing out on getting top assistant coaches in the room, missing out on getting draft prep underway while you're still waiting for your coaching staff to get together. A lot of potential risks. Then we'll kind of weigh how real or not real those risks are by looking at some other examples of head coaches who've been hired later in the hiring process and some of the results that have come from those teams going through it that way. And we'll also compare it to previous Bears head coaching searches. But as of this week, we're still at 20 as the number of candidates the Bears have put in some level of interview request for or have gone out and interviewed. I mean, I guess you don't need a request for Mike McCarthy now that he's a free agent. They didn't need a request for Mike Vrabel when he was a free agent, but coaches that they have either interviewed or have put in the process to interview is up to 20 now. The latest was Adam Stenavich, the Green Bay Packers offensive coordinator, was added to the list, I think, on Monday, if I remember correctly. This week they've done interviews with Mike McCarthy and Brian Flores, and a number of other coaches are slowly working their way through this process. I think now they've interviewed more than half of the 20 names, but not all 20 just yet as this search goes on. There's a value in talking to a lot of different people, but maybe there's a such thing as too many people. If it starts to slow down this process as you're trying to work through this list of names and get everybody interviewed, and all of a sudden, the Patriots kind of rush through their process and hire Mike Vrabel, there's one name off of the list. And if other teams start to make hires, all of a sudden you're losing your candidate choices, and every coach that's hired somewhere else is going to start filling out their coaching staff and hiring assistant coaches from other teams to be their coordinators, to be their quarterback's coach. And if you're the last team or one of the last teams to hire a coach, then you'll have less of a selection of assistant coaches up for grabs for your new head coach to fill out his staff with. And that's certainly a concerning possibility here in the future. We'll dive into that dynamic a little bit more moving forward, but that's kind of the risk right away. It's like, okay, are you going to miss out on the coach you want? Or are you going to miss out on assistant coaches? Or if you're waiting for one coach to be done with the Super Bowl, if he changes his mind, all of a sudden you've missed out on your second, third, or fourth choice afterward. And okay, all of a sudden, now who are you going to hire? Just whatever's left? Or are you really putting a lot of faith in that one coach to still sort of have a handshake agreement that, yes, when we're done playing, I will be your head coach, and I pinky promise I'm not going to change my mind or decide that I don't want to leave after all. Now, it's easy to say, okay, well, the Bears have 20 names and now they're going so much slower than every other team, and oh no, they must be falling behind. And I don't know that that's fully the case either. Like, the Patriots definitely kind of rushed their head coaching search. They did this fast. They knew who they wanted, and they got that done. They did the same thing last year with Gerard Mayo. They kind of hurried through it, and that's not always a great strategy to hire coaches super, super fast. But waiting too long can also be a problem too. Like, it does feel like the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle there when it comes to the coach hiring process. A couple other things still need to be fulfilled for the Bears. Even if they had a shorter candidate list, it's not as though they would necessarily have their head coach hired right now. Because first of all, The Rooney Rule in the NFL requires that the Bears have to interview 2 outside minority candidates. And those interviews have to be conducted in person, not just remotely or virtually. The Bears have conducted one of those in-person interviews with an outside candidate who is a minority, and that was Ron Rivera. That was the first of their 2 required Rooney Rule interviews. They've also interviewed Thomas Brown in person, but because he is an internal candidate, he does not count towards the Rooney Rule requirement. They have interviewed Brian Flores this week, but it was a virtual interview and not an in-person interview, so that does not count towards satisfying their Rooney Rule requirement. The Patriots, again, hurried through that. They interviewed Pep Hamilton and somebody else, I don't remember, kind of quickly interviewed a couple candidates. All right, we've fulfilled the rule, check the box, go hire Mike Vrabel. Maybe not the best way to do it and not the spirit of the Rooney Rule there. The Bears interviewed David Shaw also this week, and I believe his interview was virtual as well because he is technically employed by the Denver Broncos. Because one of the other obstacles here for the Bears and for every other team going through the head coaching search is that, yes, you can do all these virtual interviews, but under NFL rules, you are not allowed to do an in-person interview with a candidate who is employed by another NFL team until January 20th. So even if that team is eliminated from the playoffs or didn't make the playoffs at all, it's not until next Monday that you can actually bring them in person and interview them. So the Bears brought Mike McCarthy in person because his contract with the Dallas Cowboys expired. So they're allowed to bring Mike McCarthy in person for an in-person interview. Ron Rivera is a free agent head coach. They're allowed to bring him in for an in-person interview. I believe Mike Vrabel, because his contract with the Cleveland Browns expired, or he was sort of let free from his contract with the Browns, I believe the Patriots were allowed to interview him in person. Don't quote me on that, though, but I think that's likely the case here. But the point being that even though Brian Flores and the Vikings were eliminated from the playoffs, they cannot do an in-person interview with Brian Flores until January 20th at the absolute earliest. And obviously then when you also have the coaches who are still coaching on those playoff teams, you're not doing in-person interviews with coaches who are still actively coaching in the playoffs until those coaches are then eliminated from the playoffs after January 20th. That's how it's set for this calendar year. That date is not always January 20th. I think it's a certain number of days after the league year ends. But it kind of gives you a sense of like, even if the Bears had a smaller candidate list, they likely weren't going to be hiring anybody up to this point now. Like the Patriots are kind of the exception here rather than the team who's doing it super, super fast. Now, that being said, previous Bears head coaching searches have gone a little bit quicker than this. If you look back to when the Bears hired Mark Trestman, John Fox, Matt Nagy, Matt Eberflus, Matt Nagy was the fastest hire. He was hired January 14th of that year. What was that, 2017? 2018. January of 2018. January 14th, Matt Nagy was hired. That would already have happened this year. January 14th has come and gone. This podcast comes out on January 16th, the date the Bears hired Mark Trestman and the date the Bears hired John Fox. Now, notably, like, these were coaches that, well, not Matt Nagy was eliminated from the playoffs by that point in the process. John Fox and Mark Trestman were not coaching in the playoffs in the NFL during their searches, so it was a little bit easier to get to them and get them hired more quickly. Hiring them more quickly did not mean those were good coaching hires. Certainly for Trestman and John Fox in particular, particularly bad coaching hires at the time. Nagy, a little bit more middle of the ground there, but not a right hire for sure. More recently, though, Matt Eberflus was hired on January 27th. Now, one of the differences there is that when the Bears hired Matt Eberflus, they were also doing a general manager search at the same time. So they hired Ryan Poles first, then Poles pretty quickly decided on Matt Eberflus, but they still had to go through the GM search in addition to the head coach search, and then land on Matt Eberflus. That's less than 2 weeks from where we are now would be the date that the Bears hired Matt Eberflus, and that's not out of the question as far as a hiring date. If you can start interviewing coaches in person on January 20th, that would give the Bears 7 days between the day you can start interviewing coaches and the date that they hired their coach last time. So say the Detroit Lions lose to the Washington Commanders on Sunday, not likely, but hypothetically here, any of the playoff teams that lose this weekend, you could instantly in-person interview their coordinator of choice that week, get them hired, and you could have a Bears head coach on board by January 27th. Like, that's not totally out of the question here. It just remains to be seen how long these coaches stay in the playoff hunt. And there's some risk for that and some reward for that, because you get a coach who coached in the Super Bowl, you're getting a pretty darn good coach at what he does as a coach, but then you're also risking all of the things we talked about a little bit earlier of how long it's going to take. So we'll look at how this has played out for some other teams who waited to hire their coaches later on in the process next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. A $5 bet on the playoffs or anything, NBA, NHL, tennis, soccer, boxing, any of the combat sports, they've got it all on FanDuel. A $5 bet on any of those, if your bet is correct, not only do you get the winnings from your $5 bet, but you're getting an extra $300 in bonus bets to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is super easy to navigate, and there's so many different ways you can play with live in-game bets, same-game parlays, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Waiting till after the Super Bowl isn't necessarily the end of the world, but it comes with some concerns and risks here, right? If you're waiting for a coach who's in the Super Bowl, like let's say it's, Lions, Bills, which would be crazy, but, and you want to either hire Joe Brady or Ben Johnson, and you got to wait until after the Super Bowl to hire that coach. On the one hand, you're getting the coach who coached his team to the Super Bowl and led a Super Bowl caliber offense, quite literally. On the other hand, it's early February, and you're still waiting to hire your head coach. February, I believe the Super Bowl this year is February 9th, 2025 in New Orleans. And so the earliest you would probably hire that coach is February 10th? Would you hire him the day after the Super Bowl? You could probably do an in-person interview with them with their bye week and then decide on that. But February 10th, that's almost still a full month from when you would, away from today, when you would hire your next head coach. That's a lot of time to pass. You would imagine that most of the other head coaching candidates, or head coaching openings, I should say, would be filled by other candidates. And that those 5 other teams, Jaguars, Cowboys, Saints, Raiders, Jets, those coaching staffs, and now Patriots as well, I suppose, but they're already filled, would pick their offensive coordinators, their defensive coordinators, their quarterbacks coaches, their defensive line coaches, their special teams coaches, and have their staffs mostly filled out so that when you get to February 10th or 11th and you've hired your coach, now he's calling around saying, hey, are you available? It's no, I already agreed to go coach here, and I don't want to back out on that offer. If it's a promotion, it's one thing. If you're promoting a quarterbacks coach from another team or something, sure, but eventually you work your way down. You can't promote up everywhere. You're not going to promote someone to QB coach unless they're an assistant QB coach somewhere else. You're not going to promote someone to assistant QB coach. You're just going to have to find somebody who's unemployed somewhere else or maybe in college somewhere else. But there's a lot of ripple effects of waiting to get your head coach hired. You're always going to be able to find somebody, but are you going to be able to find the right guys for the job, the best guys for the job? And I think recent history has shown mixed results there. And it's a little bit too hard. I'll say this in the front end. It's a little bit too hard to directly correlate and say, okay, if this coach was hired late in the process on another team and things went poorly, is that because they were hired late, or would things have gone poorly if they had hired them earlier in the process anyway? We'll never know exactly, but we can at least find some correlation here between when some other coaches were hired and how that played out for some of those respective teams. I went back and looked through when other teams hired their coaches, some of the latest coaches in the last handful of years. I'm sure there have been later examples. I know Zach Taylor of the Bengals was, 5 or 6 years ago now it feels like, and he was post Super Bowl. He was a really late hire after the Bengals had gone to the Super Bowl. But I'm not including him here. I'm just looking at the last handful of seasons here. The sort of poster boy for this right now is Kevin O'Connell, the Minnesota Vikings head coach. Obviously, someone who's done a really good job with the Vikings, someone the Vikings are very happy with, Vikings fans are really happy with. Waiting for Kevin O'Connell was definitely worth it for the Vikings to get a coach that they feel like is the right coach. February 16th, after the Rams went to the Super Bowl in 2022, if I've got my timeline. I was looking through a bunch of coaches today, so I apologize if I get a date wrong by a year off or a day off. You don't hold me too tightly to it. But Kevin O'Connell hired after the Rams either won or lost that Super Bowl, and built out a staff, and obviously very happy with what's happened in Minnesota. Worth noting, though, yes, the right head coach, but Kevin O'Connell fired his defensive coordinator after 1 year. They brought in former Chicago Bears coach Ed Donatel was their defensive coordinator that first year with the Vikings. And clearly not the defensive coordinator candidate that was the right choice for them. They were one of the bottom defenses in football, and Vikings fans were more than ready to move on from Ed Donatel, even after one season. Donatel had been the Broncos defensive coordinator under Vic Fangio the year before that, but was kind of left as a coaching free agent, and that's where Kevin O'Connell landed him and brought him to Minnesota. Replaced him with Brian Flores, and the defense has been so much better since. But if the Vikings could have hired Kevin O'Connell earlier, would he have picked a better defensive coordinator, or was he going to get Ed Donatel either way? We don't know on the outside, but clearly they had to make a staffing change year one in that regime. A couple of the names that stand out to me as well in this. Mike McDaniel, the Miami Dolphins head coach, was hired February 6th. The Dolphins had to wait until after the 49ers were eliminated from the NFC Championship game to go get McDaniel, who was the 49ers offensive coordinator. McDaniel comes to Miami, replacing Brian Flores, which is, a fun little connection in here. But one season in Miami, and they make a defensive coordinator change as well. It just wasn't where they wanted it to be, wasn't the right defensive coach for them. Initially, he had brought on Josh Boyer to be their defensive coordinator. They fired Josh Boyer and brought in Vic Fangio, and Fangio was okay for a year, fired Vic Fangio or moved on from Vic Fangio, and now they have Anthony Weaver, who's top 10 defense, but getting the right coordinator has been a challenge for Mike McDaniel. And so it again begs the question, is that because it took them until February 6th to hire him, and so his first choice for coordinators weren't there, or is he just not very good at picking defensive coordinators? That's a real part of the question here. And I look around at other coaches who were hired late, like Shane Steichen with the Colts and Jonathan Gannon from the Cardinals. They were the two Eagles coordinators 2 years ago when the Eagles were in the Super Bowl. The Cardinals and Colts had to wait until after the Super Bowl to hire those two guys. February 14th, they were both hired. And neither one has had to fire a coordinator, so they seem to be able to get guys that are working for them. But are either one of them a great coach? And do you think of Shane Steichen as a great offensive coach in the NFL? Do you think of Jonathan Gannon as a great defensive coach in the NFL? They've both done some things to like, but I don't know. Those guys don't, to me, strike me as wow, what a great hire the Colts made there. And wow, what a great hire the Cardinals made there. They've been okay. You could do worse, but I don't know that strikes me as worth the wait to go get Jonathan Gannon, because look at everything he's done in Arizona. Or worth the wait to go get Shane Steichen, because look at everything he's done in Indianapolis. Not really. And then, a couple other February coaching hires in recent years. Dennis Allen, when he went to the New Orleans Saints, was hired February 7th. And when the Texans decided to hire Lovie Smith for 1 year and then fire him, they also hired him on February 7th. So, outside of Kevin O'Connell, not a lot of these late hire coaches have been great. And certainly it reflects them maybe not having great coaching staffs underneath them either, because if these coaches had hired stellar offensive or defensive coordinators, they would be in more conversations for head coaching jobs. Yes, the Bears are interviewing the Cardinals offensive coordinator and the Dolphins defensive coordinator, but neither one of those are really serious candidates for this job. So I don't necessarily fully count that as credit here. The rest, it's Kevin O'Connell and And so we don't know how much of that is a result of how late it took them to hire them and how late it was to fill out the staff. But the point being is that it's no sure thing to quote unquote wait for the right coach if he's coaching late into the playoffs. But it's also no sure thing to hurry up and hurry through the process the way the New England Patriots have this time around the coaching cycle here, because that didn't work last time for Gerard Mayo, and we'll see if that proves to be the smart choice for someone like Mike Vrabel there. I think the bigger point here is that you just need to find the right coach. Doesn't matter exactly when they're available or when they hire, as long as you get it right. And I want to look at how this works with the Bears' current coaching search list. And this is very similar to another debate we're having around the Bears' head coaching search. I want to sort of compare and contrast how this all applies to Chicago this cycle next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Rocket Money. I have the Rocket Money app on my phone. I've been using Rocket Money since before they joined up with the Locked On Podcast Network, and I cannot recommend it to you enough. It's a personal finance app, that helps not only manage your spending and lower your bills, but also it can find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. I've got my bank account and my credit card connected to it, and I like it too that it'll notify me when there's any large transaction, be like, hey, did you mean to make this transaction? And it also categorizes all your transactions so you can see how much you're spending on dining and drinks versus entertainment versus bills and other subscriptions and stuff. Like, it keeps everything together for you so you're always aware of where your money's going and start to think about using it a little bit more smartly. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down for free, by the way. It's not something that costs you for them to identify the subscriptions that you've got on your docket. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked on. That's rocketmoney.com/locked on. rocketmoney.com/locked on. There's always some risk that's going to come with waiting for your head coaching candidate if he's not available to be hired until later in the process. It is ideal if your candidate is eliminated from the playoffs early enough that you can go through the full interview process and hire him before the playoffs and the Super Bowl are complete. That is definitely better, right? Like, if you could have the same candidate on January 20th or on February 10th, you would, of course, always prefer to have that candidate earlier rather than later. There's no advantage to having to wait longer for the coach. That is 100% the case. But I don't think it's the case that if you have to wait long, that it's, doomed to fail or guaranteed to be worse because you had to wait so much longer than maybe other people. Yeah, I think the risk of assistant coaches not being available is very real. And I think that's a real issue and consequence that other coaches have had to deal with when they've been hired later in the process. I think coaches do have an advantage when they're the first ones to call and say, hey, come work for me with this team. A lot of coaches will just take the job and say, yes, NFL job, I want to do it. Let's do it. Let's go. And coaches are going to sit around and go, well, but Ben Johnson might call. So I'm going to tell Mike Vrabel no, just in case Ben Johnson gets hired and calls me. Like, that's not how that tends to work. You do definitely risk losing assistant coaches if you wait longer. But I also think that if it's the right coach, if this guy that you're hiring is going to be a good coach, then he will be a good coach, whether you hire him January 20th and he gets all his top guys, or you hire him February 10th and he gets some of his top guys, because he's going to have more than just one guy, right? It's not like Ben Johnson or Aaron Glenn or whoever has, I just need this one offensive coordinator. And if I can't get him, we're screwed. Like, no, it's Ben Johnson. There's only one defensive coordinator Ben Johnson can hire that'll be good. And then if he doesn't get that one guy, is his defense going to be bad? Like, that shouldn't be how this works if he's actually a really good head coach. And on the flip side, if he's a bad coach who picks bad assistants, then does it matter whether you get his first choice or his third choice for coordinator? Because his first choice might not be very good, and it might not be any better than his third choice if he's not a very good coach and can't identify good coaching talent. You need your head coach to be able to identify and develop coaches in addition to being able to identify and develop players. And so the right coach, a great coach, will be fine either way. I mean, we can point to Kevin O'Connell with the Minnesota Vikings. Like, okay, he goes for Ed Donatel, doesn't do so well, fires his defensive coordinator after one season. Replaced him with Brian Flores, and they've had a top 5 defense ever since, top 10 defense. Like, the Vikings were one of the best teams in the NFL this season, even though Kevin O'Connell, got it wrong, sort of, with his first defensive coordinator hire. Like, he picked pretty objectively the wrong guy, and it didn't doom him as a head coach or doom his Minnesota Vikings tenure just because he got that first pick wrong, because it turns out he's a pretty good coach who can connect with and identify coaching talent and help develop coaches and, get this team going. I mean, obviously, not that Kevin O'Connell is some perfect coach that has no flaws or anything, but the point being, like, it wasn't a death knell. It wasn't the end of the world that they had to wait longer for him and maybe didn't get the right defensive coordinator for the first year. Not ideal. You want that coach to nail it the first time, and maybe if you had hired them earlier, he could have nailed it the first time for whatever reason, but like, it's not the end of the world. And I think the timing aspect thing here is very similar to the offensive coordinator versus CEO defensive coordinator debate in Chicago, where it's like, do you have to hire an offensive coach to be the Bears' next head coach? No. Is it easier if you do? Probably. But you got to make sure you get the right coach. Whether he's an offensive guy or a defensive guy, doesn't matter, as long as he's the right coach. Because if you hire an offensive guy who's the wrong coach, it's still going to be a bad coaching hire. Like, being an offensive guy doesn't automatically make him a great head coach. Just like hiring a guy earlier versus hiring a guy later. Like, yeah, it'd be preferable if you could hire him earlier, but hiring him earlier doesn't mean he's going to be a great coach, as compared to how hiring later doesn't mean he's going to be a bad coach. Like, as long as you get the right coach, it doesn't matter when you hire. And as long as you get the right coach, it doesn't matter if he's the offensive coordinator or the head coach. We did a whole podcast on that offensive coordinator versus CEO pathway to head coach debate, a week or two ago now on the podcast. So I'm not going to rehash that whole debate there, but like, we went in depth on like why it doesn't have to be an offensive coordinator. A good head coach will be able to find good offensive coordinators, multiple, and develop good offensive coordinators, even if they're not an offensive coordinator themselves. And that's a really important part of this process. Just like how hiring them earlier versus hiring them later is important, but not critical. It would be ideal, but not necessary. As long as the guy you're waiting for is actually the right guy. And that's the big challenge here. That's where we have trouble trusting George McCaskey and Kevin Warren and Ryan Poles, that they might wait for the right guy, but do we trust them that that'll actually be the right guy? It's worth the wait. If Ben Johnson is the next Sean McVay, that is absolutely worth the wait. Of course, we would all wait until February 15th or February 10th or whatever the date's going to be for Sean McVay or Andy Reid or whoever that coach is going to be. But you have to be sure that they're the right coach. And whoever the Bears pick, they're going to come out and say, hey, we are certain this was the best coach, the best candidate for the job. That they're going to believe that. But we won't know until that coach actually becomes a head coach, is in Chicago, and is leading this team. And usually it takes a couple of seasons to really get a sense of whether that coach was truly the best coach, whether it was truly the right choice. And we're going to have to see what this looks like. But I think the point being, we're going to wait for a while here. Probably going to be at least, like I said, January 20th is the first day you can interview people in person. And then the Bears are going to want to do a handful of in-person interviews and then decide between those. And if there's coaches still coaching, they were not going to be able to in-person interview them either. Like, I would expect, as long as the Lions keep winning, it might be February before we get a Chicago Bears head coach. And that's going to be annoying. And we're probably going to be sick of talking about it after about another week or so here, because it's like, just pick somebody at some point, right? But at least we're not still adding candidates to the list. Fingers crossed. I guess they probably still could, but like, let's hope 20 is the number that they stop at here. And then pretty soon they reduce it down to 5. And then we can really go in depth on those 5 candidates and come to a consensus on like, here's who the Bears should hire. The answer is still probably going to be Ben Johnson, but we can at least kind of get a better sense of, okay, if not Ben Johnson, then who's plan B? Probably Aaron Glenn for me personally. But I do want to go through and rank some of these Bears coaching candidates in the coming days here on the podcast. And I also want to talk a little bit more about, going in depth with these guys and feeling like are the Bears going about this the right way? And what does this process really need to look like as it starts to narrow down a little bit more here? So plenty more to break down for you here on Locked On Bears. Make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Be sure to check out any of our other Locked On Podcast Network podcasts for your second listen. We cover all your Chicago sports teams: Bulls, Blackhawks, White Sox, Cubs, University of Illinois, University of Northwestern, or if you got favorite teams that aren't in the Chicago area, we're covering all your favorite leagues as well, with daily podcasts coming your way wherever you find Locked On Bears. So go check out another Locked On podcast for your second listen. Coming back tomorrow, make Locked On Bears your first listen once again for another opportunity to bear down.